We have Simran Agarwal, who's I knew my Spanish accent was gonna make it too. So he's a doctoral candidate, like willing to present in 2 months. So ready to defend her viva very soon at the University of Sorbonne in Paris. Her research is titled Platform Governance and the Political Economy of the Digital News Industry in India. And you have been looking at the distinct forms, mechanisms, and interests of platform governance that shape digital news speech and the industry in India. She has several visiting positions, one of them at the Department of Media Study, University of Amsterdam, so you know the crowd over there, and the Center of Science Humanities in New Delhi. Prior to your doctoral work, you were at the Center for Political Studies at the Indian Institute of Technology in Bombay. So, Simran, I think the floor is yours.
All right, great. So, sorry, it's just two screens. It's always difficult to coordinate them. Okay. So good afternoon, and good evening to those that are joining from the Eastern time zones. My name is Simran, and as Paloma and Joao mentioned, I'm a final year PhD at the Sorbonne University. First, of course, I would like to thank the organization Paloma, Christian, Joao for inviting me. I know that I have myself found these really useful and really beneficial, especially because they provide these sort of critical tools to examine the amorphous entities that are platforms and also notions of platform governance. So thank you for that. And I'm really excited to talk about my doctoral research. And I think that this topic is really interesting and relevant for this talk series because this nexus that I'm talking about is relatively understudied, either due to a siloed examination of state and platform mechanisms, or because the larger Western focus of research, where conversations surrounding the role of the state are not so prominent at the moment. But keeping in line with the structure of these talks, I will focus on the methodological approaches I take, the challenges I've encountered, the sort of rerouting processes I have to do to circumvent those challenges, and also the subjectivities of doing this research in India. That said, I won't be talking or discussing much about the findings of my project, but I'm more than happy to discuss that in the questions or personally at a later time. So before I jump into the talk, I want to offer a sort of brief background into why studying this subject became important to me as a researcher in 2021. And this is really brief. So of course, first, like the global trends in platformization of news, Indian news saw this sort of encapsulation of news consumers and advertisers by international tech platforms, which directly led to the reorganization and intertwining of news industry's institutional setting and production logics with that of platforms' desire for native production or for chasing virality of content and producing more advertiser-friendly content. Simultaneously, the socio-political context becomes really crucial, and this is not to essentialize the uniqueness of India, but also to emphasize the conditions that shape the state of media in the country. So this includes a reflection of historical and contemporary political control over critical news media and free speech, which has led India into consistently sort of backsliding on the press freedom index and different democracy indices. And while that paints a sort of picture of the state of free speech in the country, it is important not to assume that the media industry in India is a flag bearer of free speech or interested in doing critical news, right? Studies in political economy of the media in India have highlighted how political ownership and consistent policy silences have supported market concentration by those that are close to the state. And therefore, certain players and certain news organizations have benefited from pushing the dominant state narrative rather than undertake the sort of watchdog role in news. Therefore, assuming a sort of top-down governance of these news players in India would misconstrue the power of these media organizations in actually negotiating state and platform governance, right? And while this governance of online news is taking place by the state and platforms, we need to know that it did not occur in isolation. but in the foreground of state and platform interactions. So I'm using these images again, but it sort of give you an idea that while there was this sense of growing suspicion and dismissal of platforms that took the form of tech clash in the West later on, Modi, or our prime minister, was going around Silicon Valley and promising tech companies an enabling policy environment in India, which then led to significant infrastructural and financial investments in the country. But surprisingly, the sort of only sore thumb that stuck out in their tech platform and state relation was the governance of critical news. And this became particularly evident when Twitter refused to take down accounts of journalists and media houses that were critical of the state. And in return for their sort of retaliation, the state used coercive measures and physical intimidation to force compliance from the platforms. So these events sort of highlighted the paradox of Indian aspiration for international capital, but at the same time, assertion of Indian state supremacy over platforms, at least in the matters of governance of speech. So my research looked into the political economy of governance of online news in India, where I broadly asked, what does platform governance of online news entail in illiberal democracies and concentrated news markets such as India? And how does the linguistically, politically, economically diverse Indian news organization strategically negotiate platform governance in all its forms? And so just to flag this off before we sort of go deeper into the contours of the research design, there are plenty of debates surrounding different types of platforms and their governance issues. But my research focuses on search, social media, and news aggregator platforms that are relevant to the news industry. But, platforms such as e-commerce, e-governance, labor brokering platforms, all of them are very relevant to the state platform nexus in India. At the same time, I don't focus on news influencers or user-generated opinion content, but on formalized news organizations of different sizes and capacities in India. With this context in mind, I began the research with a review of theoretical contributions from political science and emerging scholarship of platform studies and platform governance. I understand governance as explained by Foucault, meaning the study of those institutions and mechanisms engaged in the conduct of conduct, which is shaping and guiding and also affecting the conduct of those who are governed, which is the news organizations and industry in these cases. And here again, literature from platform governance, especially Gillespie's twofold thrust of governance of by the state and governance by the platforms, was a particularly striking entry point for me, because I was trying to understand both the state and platform governance of speech in India. And so when situating these debates within culture industries, I was also led to the identification of more structural forms of platform governance that go beyond mere political and policy to how governance is achieved through dominance in the market and infrastructuralization, which tends to induce dependence and capture not just of institutional practices, but also industrial networks. But the more I read these works, I realized that they sort of failed to capture the dynamic and complex state platform nexus that was unfolding in India, and was also predominant in shaping the landscape of free speech and condition of news businesses. Therefore, my thesis developed a third prong to Gillespie's platform governance of and governance by, which was the governance through platforms, where I identified that predominantly the Indian state compels digital platforms in governing online news in their interests, where the state explicitly acknowledges the political value of platforms infrastructure and uses it as an apparatus to control and structure online news. So a strategically important first step for me was to map the relevant actors governing the field of online news in India, which included these sort of direct mechanisms of control and ordering, but also the state's indirect mechanisms of ordering. And so you can see all of these complicated field of multiple actors, mechanisms, and their interests. Therefore, the process of studying it was not straightforward. And so all the researchers on this call would agree that selecting the appropriate tools for examination often involves layers of testing, course correcting, patient coding before patterns of meaning start to emerge. So after much deliberation, I undertook a mixed methods approach involving policy document analysis, semi-structured interviewing, purposive ethnographic observation, and case studies. These methods have been developed and widely applied in social science research, and this table here gives an overview how a combination of these data sources responded to specific research questions of this thesis. And the next sections, I will discuss the rationale behind these sources, demonstrate the analysis process, and also the challenges encountered. So, media governance researchers have previously argued for the value of a systematic study of media policy documents, as they are the prime artifacts to gain insight into the contextual and institutional choices that influence them. But while media policies have been a subject of examination, platform policies are rarely studied in the respect of news specifically, despite them being the most formal communication available to news institutions to make informed decisions of how platforms govern them, but also because financial and technical instruments are often shielded in opacity. So in between the sort of tedious legalese and strategic ambiguity, platform policy and state policy documents are carriers of meanings. On one hand, of permissible and punishable conduct, but also they carry carry hints and nudges of desired conduct. And this information is available through policy documents mobilizing certain values and incentivization of certain behaviors by the news organizations. And therefore, a systematic study of these documents can reveal how the state and platforms choose to govern online news industry and what are the implications of that. So interview tools have also been widely used in social science research to gain an insight into the subjective experiences of respondents. And within platform governance, it has been useful to understand the institutional thinking and processes behind shaping conduct. And so I took semi-structured interviewing at two levels. First, with the state and platform representatives to verify and substantiate the findings from document analysis. And two, with news industry and civil society actors to understand the diverse perceptions of this governance and also trends in industrial and institutional negotiations. I also took purposive ethnographic observation at two news organizations. And ethnographic or ethnographies have particularly found an uptake within platform studies where sociologists and digital anthropologists have argued that entering the field sort of deconstructs the black box narratives of platforms. But rather than adapting or adopting this full immersive ethnography at platforms, my approach was focused on gaining a comparative understanding of the granular everyday transformations to platform governance at an institutional level at news organizations with varying interests and capacities to negotiate state and platform control. The other thing is the selective case study analysis, which involved mapping controversies of events highlighting subjective platform governance in India, which made case studies a very context-rich site of inquiry, unraveling how governance actions are constructed and also contested. And it was also important to take a historical analysis of tracing the continuities and disjuncture of governance of news in India. So the selected policy documents of state and platform were congruent to the three-pronged approach, and they were categorized into primary and secondary documents. For instance, in the governance of documents that lay down binding rules for news institutions and punishments for them were primary documents, and consultation papers and drafts which give information into the iterative policy process but don't lay down binding rules were secondary documents. So as that, I sampled 33 primary documents which underwent systematic coding at a later stage and 113 secondary documents which included policy consultation, drafts, press releases, and parliamentary discussions. Similarly, for governance by, news-specific policies for content, monetization, technical requirements were the sort of first-hand expression for news organizations. And they also reflect the normative powers of platforms in telling publishers what they should do to maximize their success on platforms. So as a result, news organizations keep themselves updated with these transient policy documents, as well as best practices, even though the benefits of complying with them are often hypothetical, but the sanctions of reduced visibility or demonetization are very real. So this study then again included 53 primary documents from Google and Facebook, or Meta, and 57 secondary documents, which had blog posts, public communications, and Google News Initiative and Meta Journalism Project information. Similarly, for governance through, I studied India's platform liability laws and executive interventions into platform self-regulation codes. And another important source was platforms' transparency reports. Even though they normally contain inadequate contextual information, certain instances of contextual data, such as these, were really useful and relevant to the study. I know they're not very clear, but they're basically, there's a case from Google which says that they blocked 14 YouTube channels that criticize the government because they perceive physical threat for Google staff in India. And Meta talks about how they blocked access to news pages on the request of the government, even though it did not violate their community standards. And so these instances reflect how platform rarely contests state governance due to the risk of physical intimidation or economic and reputational costs in the country. I also tracked these controversies and instances reported on Indian news sites, which involved two forms of prominent instances where the Indian state compels and often conflicts with platforms for removing news stories, or the instances where platforms' arbitrary platform governance of news reveals the underlying contentious influence of the state. In total, 126 primary documents of state and platforms underwent manual thematic coding on Atlas. Well, I don't know if you're aware of the software, but it's like NVivo. And this involved collective categorization and subcategorization of pieces of data within the document, so words, lines, paragraphs, which were then converted into main themes and sub-themes. I deductively coded the main themes as site, function, and values, which corresponded to where the governance took place in the news cycle, what was the function or effect of implementation of that mechanism for news, and how was it legitimized through a mobilization of values and rationales given by the state and platforms. The sub-themes under these main themes were inductively coded, first as verbatim text and then combined based on common patterns of meaning. So policy document analysis are very useful, but it has many limitations. They are unstable. We already know platform policies tend to change. They tend to disappear from their original spot on their websites and such. But the Indian state policy have also been consistently and regularly amended, leading to an industry-wide confusion over which clause under which version of the policy is retained, revised, and therefore implicating news. So tracking that was an arduous process. Similarly, platform opacity is spoken of, but the same is relevant for the Indian state documents, where many of the decision-making processes take place behind closed doors, with very few public reports available for researchers. I've already talked about the limitation of transparency documents, but also I want to point out how these limitations are on the same sort of at the same level opportunities for researchers to systematically work with data that is available and also create sort of codebook samples that allow for research design portability across different projects. Next, semi-structured interviews included 48 interviews in 2 rounds with governance elites and industrial experts. So this, at the level of governors, included the Indian state and platform representatives of relevant ministries, and from Facebook, Google, Daily Hunt, ShareChat, and InShots, which are the domestic news aggregators. And within the governed, it included 32 interviews at 12 news institutions with different scale and language operations and also political leaning, and also civil society organizations. Here, the semi-structured interviewing over a fixed style of questioning, such as surveys, was really useful in contextually building knowledge along with the interviewee, but also probing them for specific themes and issues that emerge during the conversation. And here's just a rough sampler, sorry for the really not visible image, but a sampler of the interview guide of the topics that I posed to different stakeholders based on the purpose. And these were also systematically coded to understand the institutional thinking of the governors, which is state and platforms, and also trends in institutional and industrial negotiations. Again, while I was able to reach a vast set of actors, interviewing in person was not easy due to continual COVID protocols in India. Also, the unwillingness of the interviewees to meet in person, either because the topic of my research was too contentious or the lack of interest for inviting researchers into their settings. Similarly, the elite nature of my interviewees meant that fixed sampling was not possible due to the lack of access. I had to repurpose my research scope several times. For instance, the initial design included interviews with human moderators of news content in India for different platforms. But despite conducting 3 interviews with individuals, I had to eliminate these interviews from my research because respondents were afraid of their companies finding out. Similarly, Twitter, which is a very relevant actor to understand governance through the Indian state, was not included because of the ongoing conflict between the Indian state and Twitter, which meant that all representatives refused to talk to me. But regardless, I made many cold contacts through LinkedIn, which was surprisingly a very useful resource of researching in India. And I also showed up at a lot of platform-sponsored industrial events of really large scale, where governance elite showed up for a couple of minutes, and after that, it was a race to whoever got that ear first to talk to them. Here again, it is important to highlight how my positionality, specifically how my caste and class identity, command over language, physical presentation, and institutional affiliation to an international organization shaped my ability to access this field. And adapting to these requirements meant that I had a better chance sometimes to access these elites, while many of the civil society actors I interviewed did not. Finally, I spent about 4 and 5 days each at 2 sort of contrasting newsrooms to understand how their everyday negotiating practices and thinking towards platform and state governance unfolded. It helped me verify the influence of economic capital, institutional interest, editorial and political leaning in how these news organizations contested or leveraged the state and platform control. These are just some images indicative of where I spent my 4 and 5 days in India. So yeah, while ethnographic observations also support and enhance my findings, they suffered from limitations. India has a really large news market, and my own sort of linguistic barriers and also barriers to access because of a PhD budget meant that I was only able to cover Hindi and English news organizations in the capital, which means that 20 other official Indian languages fall out of this analysis. Similarly, there were a lot of confidentiality requirements. So while I had access to these newsrooms and sometimes their editorial and data analytical meetings, I can only limitedly include them in my analysis. And once again, the positionality of the research and my ability to adapt to the sociocultural context of different news organizations, that is, sort of portray my political leaning to sort of congregant to their understanding, played a huge role in conducting these ethnographies. So yeah, in conclusion, I want to talk a little bit about the behind the scenes of actually researching this subject in India. And this is because I know we can't treat methodology as a one-size-fits-all formula. More researchers doing similar research in India may not actually be able to copy-paste what I've done here, but also because talking about these contextual challenges is what transforms a generic methodology into a more grounded one. So yeah, academic research was, or in my experience, found to be culturally undervalued. and not widely understood. For me, this meant that I had to tirelessly explain the value of my profession, of my research to my respondents, but also constantly respond to questions such as, what will I get in return for answering your questions or giving you my data? Similarly, I was often told by my respondents that if you want to be taken seriously, you should make business cards, otherwise you won't be valued in the field. And in addition to that, social science research in India has faced the wrath of political censorship with heavy defunding, sacking of scholars, rejection of projects that are critical of the state, which meant that my topic, which looks at the state governance of free speech, was not welcomed by many of my respondents. And so the direct implication of the condition of social science in the country is also on the quality of data sources, which are ridden by poor archiving, and also limited published research on these issues in India, making the knowledge divide even wider. And as mentioned before, there are intersectional differences, but also there is a limited there's still limited internet penetration in the country, which means researching on tech platforms, the Indian state only covers a very small fraction of what is out there. Having said that, I think challenges are also opportunities, and also a call for the research communities to support and overcome these sort of epistemic inequalities in knowledge production. So with that, I want to end my talk here, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you.